A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai, until double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone, for teaching us this truth. Salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquath and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to read through this article I came across on CTV News in regards to declining fertility rates. And here it says Canada is among countries with ultra low fertility rate. What is behind the drop? And here it says, I want to read through this a little bit, real quick, and kind of just give my 2 cents, my spiritual 2 cents in regards to this whole drop and so on and so forth. Because children are not really seen as something, as a blessing anymore, rather than they're seen as essentially a burden. As a matter of fact, you don't really have to go too far. You can like go on TikTok and YouTube. And yesterday I saw some clips of some women. They were complaining about essentially the burden and responsibility of actually having children, right? So the way the way motherhood and parenthood is seen, especially motherhood, essentially it's been hijacked, has been bamboozled. Going back to those philosophies and those fruit that Eve had eaten of, right? Where they're not seen as something that is actually conducive to life. It's seen rather than as a burden. It's seen rather as something that is not you know essentially satanic, right? They leave their children, you know um you know to essentially fend for themselves. What I'm saying? There's been situations where children have been left in a hot vehicle. There's been instances where children are not essentially cared for, right, in this place, right? So you know um here it says Canada's fertility rate is a record low in 2024 as family trajectories continue to evolve, according to Stats Canada, which was released a new survey examining the complex factors that which whether or not women decide to have children. And children really are a blessing. Let me get this here in Psalms. This is Psalms chapter 127, verse 3. And it says here, Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord Yahweh, Bashem Shai, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man, verse 5, that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. So essentially it's a good thing to be able to have lots of children, especially to see them and grow up and so on and so forth. What I'm saying? Because essentially you're making duplicate copies of yourself. But Jake does that essentially in wickedness because, they do it, but they don't have any understanding, and then they duplicate themselves in wickedness, right? As opposed to giving them righteous examples of how to actually be. That's why scriptures say wisdom is the principal thing. So, the ways children are seen in this society are, especially amongst our women, it's seen as a burden and it's seen as something not to do. It's seen as, okay, I would rather be more self-willed and sacrifice my own children, assuming they make it out of the womb, that is, right? Sacrifice, not having children and essentially postpone motherhood. It's seen as something, okay, you can have children at any time, right? And that's why the scriptures say you shall surely not die, right? Because you realize, like, okay, when you have taken in those ways of the serpent, you realize that, okay, you did not die right away, but further down the line, you start to realize, your life is essentially cut short by following these different philosophies such as feminism, because what it has taught you is to extend that period of time of being so-called single, you know, playing the field like a man would, because you were taught that you and the man are the same, you and the man are equal, you and the man can do anything, and that's not the case. And then you've realized you get to a point where, okay, you actually want to have children, which is how the Lord designed you to be, and care for your own children, and then you realize that you got the shit end of the stick because you thought in your mind you were a man, right? Steve Harvey has that. I think it's a book he has, or it's a movie. It says like act like a woman or think like a man or something like that, or think like a man and act like a woman. One of the two. But it's not. That's not righteous programming, right? So you see how that detrimental effects of feminism has strongly impacted the way our family structure has come out to be, right? That's something very, very detrimental, right? So it really, is important, how our women are actually taught, right? But essentially in this society, our women have been hijacked by the enemy to see, and then programmed to not further their own households, because that's what's happening here, right? So they're not in tune with the programming of the man, or especially a man who actually knows his identity, right? So this is really when you look at it from what's that, I guess that if you look at it from in terms of psychological warfare, this is very deep psychological warfare, is to basically break up the family and empower the woman and remove the man out of the household, and then essentially to trick her and give her certain implant her mind with different philosophies and thinking that she's better than the man, right? That you don't need the man. And this is the same sentiment that is seen today. So this is what's also contributing to this attitude of how women approach, their lives, especially our women, today, right? The other nations too, but I'm mostly speaking about, our women, because we are the ones that are strongly being affected by, these different fruits and these different philosophies, right? But here I'm going to go down to, I just want to read this here, and it says Canada's low fertility rate of 1.25 children per woman in 2024 put it to an ultra low fertility category, often used to describe countries with the TFR. So TFR just means total fertility rate below 1.30 children per woman. It says others in the group based in 2024 data include Switzerland, which was at 1.29, Luxembourg 1.25, Finland 1.25 again, Italy 1.18, Japan 1.15, Singapore 0.97, South Korea 0.75, according to StatsCan. And this is a quote here by the agency, and it says, and the strong decline in fertility rate is due not only to decreased birth rate, but it's also to the increase of number of women who do not have children, either by choice or by circumstance, or because they are delaying motherhood, right? So that's one of the reasons they're delaying it, because they're going back to the point. They want to actually take on that mentality of thinking that they are a man. So they go and acquire education. But when they go and acquire education, they're going to acquire the serpent's education, because a lot of our women are in these different schools, colleges, institutes, colleges and universities, trying to get a master's or a bachelor's or a degree or whatever it is, right? To essentially indirectly, covertly usurp their authority over the man, because they were bamboozled to believe that they don't need one, right? So here, continuing on, as a matter of fact, let me get this in Corinthians. This is 1 Corinthians 3, verse 19, and it says, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness of the most with the Most High. For it is written, He hath taken the wise in His own craftiness," right? So, this wisdom that, a lot of our women, acquire in these different schools, that wisdom is not really conducive into and cannot be helped, because you realize you still have a man to be able to go back to. You still need a man to be able to receive counsel, right? And that's on the other end as well. That's why it's also important for our men to actually have more than, have essentially a relationship with Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai, because a man back in the ancient times as well provided a sense of not just um physical resources, but they also had spiritual resources, and they were sought after in regards to certain matters. And I'm using this example, and I'm thinking about Joseph, because prior to Joseph actually being lifted up and being essentially at a helm where Egypt needed essentially an action plan to be able to provide and manage certain resources, he was well sought after because he was able to actually give down and break down certain dreams, and being able to help the Pharaoh at that time. So he received favor. So, really and truly, man needs to be in tune with Yahweh Bashim Shai, and the woman needs to understand that she needs her man. But this has essentially been a mindset that is not far from our women, because their mindset is essentially to be more of pleasure for themselves. So they would essentially have that mentality where, okay, let's just let me just do what I want to do without actually regarding any of the consequences, because in their mind frame they believe that men and women are strongly the same, going back to those philosophies, right? So let me go back here to the article. As a matter of fact, let me get this, hold on, because this is just the Lord designed us to be fruitful and multiply, right? So this is Exodus chapter 21 verse 10, and it says, if he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and duty of marriage, and shall not diminish, right? So we were designed as the men to have more than one wife, right? So, and this would this is I'll say it like this, if this shows, first and foremost, it shows that the ways of Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai are strongly needed on the planet Earth. It shows that his ways, as the scriptures say, are higher than our ways. You see all these different nations. I listed a bunch of other nations in the article. It said Luxembourg, it said Italy, Singapore, South Korea. How is it, okay, you have all these nations suffering from a fertility rate, yet for all, you can't figure out what to do in order to increase the fertility rate? Like some nations, I believe Russia, I don't know if this is, I could be fact checked on this, but I've heard of situations where, I believe it was Russia, that they were offering their women like a stipend, or essentially like a sum of money, to be able to incentivize their nation to have children, right? Because if you're a ruler, you understand that you need subjects, right? And the scriptures, I think there's a scripture in Proverbs that says that a king essentially without subjects is nothing, right? But if you understand rulership, you understand that you need servants. You need to be able to actually have bodies, human resources, like they call it, like they call it in the corporations here in America, Canada, the West, the US. You understand that you need bodies. You need people to be able to manage your enterprise. You need people to be able to perform certain duties, to be able to make sure that your kingdom is running properly, running smoothly. You need to make sure that they're replenishing the population. But what do you have in this society now? You have two different conundrums here. You have two different problems. What you have, number one, is an aging population where the older demographic, because it's things are so expensive, and they're not able to take care of themselves, they don't have a lot of substance, they have a harder time trying to retire, right? So they feel the need to delay retirement. They can, sit down, chill, whatever. They feel there's still a bit of an obligation for them to still work, where they might be working part-time, right? And this is going back to the ways of the Lord. They don't, they disregard the elderly, they disregard the hoary head, right? And you have the other problem where things are so expensive, where the population, the younger population, they don't see the incentive to have children, because it seems more like a burden rather than a pleasure. It seems more like, okay, I can't do this. I have to constantly keep working, right? Because Esau has essentially done a very good job in placing, very heavy economic restraints upon the people, where you don't feel that obligation to actually do so. So now you're at a standstill. You have a population that's just gonna, wither and decline, right? They're not having the same. They're not replenishing the population anymore, because they don't see a need to, right? So essentially you have somebody who is an unwise king destroying his people. And going back to those different philosophies, if you actually implemented the ways of the Heavenly Father, you wouldn't have these problems in the first place, right? So let me get Sirach here. Oh, Sirach. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 10, verse 1, and it says, "A wise judge would instruct his people, and the government of the prudent man is well ordered. As the judge of the people is himself, and so are his officers. And what manner of the man of the ruler of the city is, as such are all that dwell therein. An unwise king destroyeth his people, but through the prudence of them which are in authority, the city shall be inhabited." So we're living in a society where you're living under an example of an unwise king who is destroying his people. So the destruction doesn't always have to be something physical. That destruction, for when you look at it, from a macro lens, okay, that destruction, okay, is also taking place mentally as well, right? Going back to the examples of our women, with the institutions and the schools, because that's the common occurrence that is happening, where they believe that they are the man, and essentially you don't have a population that's replenishing, but you have a population of whores. So that, when you have that, okay, there's nobody, coming together to actually bring forth children, right? So you have something like a stagnant population. So it's just going to kind of it's just going to start to kind of like behave like a bottleneck. Like, when a bottleneck starts to kind of become more narrow and narrow and narrow, and that's basically what you have right now, as opposed to a population that's constantly producing and replenishing itself, right? Let me go here. It says here, education and work were also determining factors of women of childbearing age, says the agency, as there is generally a higher proportion of women without any children among university graduates and unemployed women. Meanwhile, it says motherhood is more common amongst married women and women who practice religion, StatsCan said. It says landed immigrant women are also more likely to be mothers in Canada compared to Canadian-born women in 2024, it found. It says here, StatsCan noted that women who are part of a certain racialized groups may be associated with differing childbearing trajectories, suggesting that there are cultural considerations at play. It says, for example, about 6 in 10 West Asian and Chinese women had no children, while the same was true not only for 40% of Latin American and Arab, according to StatsCan. These results show fertility does not depend solely on individual preferences and reflects complex socioeconomic cultural factors, particularly for women under the age of 40, agency said. It says they also show the importance of policies to encourage balancing career and motherhood, right? So really and truly, when you go into um I guess the career of motherhood really was to help to take care of the household and take care, of the children, right? And to be able, and on top of that, also, you know, I remember growing up, and one of the things that I've noticed, like for example, like my grandmother had, they had some knowledge when it came to certain herbs, certain bushes. They knew how to make tea. They were very, very good cooks, so they had a certain skills within the household to be able to further the household. So certain they call that like home economics, right? So essentially, they were taught how to, perform, put together certain recipes. They were taught, certain skills when it came to gardening. And those are very important skills that are essentially lost, because now your children, our people don't see, like, you don't see the big hijacking, this major hijacking that is taking place upon you as a nation. You see, our people see the trivial matters of what actually is occurring, face value, within your own people, right? They don't see the collective of actually what's going on. So how can you have a certain mindset of nation building when you think very trivial? I'm speaking about your Israelites, right? Because our people are destroyed, for lack of knowledge, right? You don't see what the enemy has strongly done to you and done to your women as a whole, right? So if your women are hijacked, then what does that do? It creates a stagnancy within your population, and you don't produce your own children, because that's one of the things that the enemy fears really, is a production of our own children, especially men, especially males, right? And I'll give you a quick example of that real quick. Just give me 1 second. This is Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, and it says, "And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah." And it says, "And he said, when you do the office of a midwife, and to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, kill him. Then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live." But the midwives feared the Most High, and said, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved them the men children alive. So they had a different type of mentality, because they understood that through the man comes through is the seed, carries the seed, right? So what the Egyptians can do, if they have a lot of girls, like say for example Israelite girls, growing up and being born, what does that do? That extends their seed. So because they're just now a vessel for them to extend their own bloodline, their own lineage and population. So now you just have now a lot of so-called a lot of Egyptian men can impregnate those women, and then you produce more Egyptian babies, as a producing as opposed, I should say, to producing more Israelite, babies, right? Because at this time, Jake was multiplying, and they were seen as like, even though they were in captivity, they were still seen as a threat, right? So this is, our people don't understand like the big picture of like what's, of what's going on, man. Let me just let me see. Let me just read this. And it says in verse 18, and it says, "And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done this thing? And he saved the men children alive, right? So they had a mentality of like, yo, we need to produce, we need to keep our men children. But what do you have in this society? You kind of have, not even kind of, but you have the complete opposite, where the women, their mindsets already been hijacked. So the enemy doesn't have to um give them the command to do so. They've already planted that seed, those philosophies in their minds. So all they have to do is go to the Planned Parenthood and off their children, right? So they do it on their own, right? They don't have to actually threaten them anymore. I want to put burdens upon them. I want to make them convinced that, okay, live your best life and so on and so forth, and you don't actually extend your own, you don't actually find a man of your own nation to actually have children with, to actually replenish your population. Because these other nations understand, and they fear that, what's one of the things they fear? They fear that the Jake essentially multiplying and even working in unison. That's even more threatening, right? So they perform all these different, they leave out all these snares for you, to prevent you from actually multiplying. The scriptures say that to turn thou, O Jacob, that thou mayst be illuminated, right? So understand what the essentially the devices, the craftiness of of Esau, of what he's doing to you, right? So you know um I guess that's pretty much it. I didn't want to, I kind of finished the article here, but people don't really see the bigger picture as to what's going on, in terms of the hijacking of your nation, starting with our women, right? So I'll leave the lesson there, but I sincerely pray, hopefully this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.